Today, we're diving into one of the biggest stories at the intersection of politics, business, and technology.
And the most important purchase that is going on right now is TikTok. TikTok, number one. And I hope it goes through because it can be consequential.
That is Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu talking to US influencers about the importance of controlling social media narratives and also TikTok, whose US operations have been forced into a high-stakes restructuring to remove Chinese ownership, and a new deal is on the table. Why is it so important, you might ask? It's not just a business transaction. It's a deal that would determine who will influence what the 170 million Americans that use TikTok will see, and essentially mold their views and perspectives of what's happening in the world. This is the new battleground, explains Netanyahu.
We're going to have to use the tools of battle. The weapons change over time. You can't fight today with swords. That doesn't work very well, okay? And you can't fight with cavalry. That doesn't work very well. But we have to fight with the weapons that apply to the battlefields in which we're engaged. And the most important ones are social media.
Big names like Oracle, Silver Lake, and Abu Dhabi's MGX are discussing taking nearly half of TikTok's US operations. While Oracle and Silver Lake are US-based companies, MGX is from the UAE, and would be one of the few non-American owners of the platform's US operations. To make sense of all this, we'll hear from experts who can unpack the deal from different angles. We'll explore why the valuation of the deal is so low, understand to what extent shareholder companies impact content, and what would TikTok influenced by a Gulf country look like. We'll also explore how algorithm access and content moderation by companies and their owners play into global soft power, and to what extent. Because this isn't only about TikTok, it's about who will shape the minds of users on one of the most viewed social media platforms in the world. This is Business Extra, and I'm your host, Salim Saeed. I'll be speaking to Jim Lauterbeck in San Francisco, who's been delving into this topic as the editor and CEO of the newsletter called Inside the Creator Economy, which is exactly what we're trying to get into. Jim, welcome to Business Extra.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So Jim, since Donald Trump announced the deal was taking place last week, can you share with us what we actually know to be true? I know there's a lot of speculation around this, but there have been reports of Oracle, Silver Lake, and Abu Dhabi's MGX getting a 45% share in TikTok's US operations, with ByteDance being capped at 19%, along with some other US investors. Can you tell us what is really happening?
Here's what we think we know. 80% of the US operations of TikTok are being sold to a consortium. But the consortium itself, this US consortium of Silver Lake and MGX and Oracle, are only getting about roughly 35 to 40% of it, maybe a little bit more, maybe 45%, but under 50%, leave it at that. TikTok retains 20%, and the rest of that 30% or so, goes to existing investors and new investors. Okay, so the $14 billion is the purchase price we think, but we don't know. $14 billion could be the entire valuation for the whole deal. So it's unclear to me whether that $14 billion is just the 80% that's being carved out or includes the 20% that TikTok is retaining. Okay, so that's one question. Second, we have been told that there will be 7 board seats. 1 board seat will be held by TikTok. The other 6 presumably held by some of the members of that consortium that we talked about, Oracle, Silver Lake, MGX. Some probably members of that other 30%, but we don't know who's going to represent them. We also don't know board composition. We don't know if TikTok, even though it only has 20%, will hold any veto rights over things that happen. So those are more questions than answers. We also, from an overall profit perspective, and this is really interesting, 50% of the profits from this US operation that's being carved out goes to TikTok, even though they only have 20% of the ownership. So I find that fascinating as well. A couple of things specifically in the bill that was passed, I don't know, it was passed who knows how long ago. It was over a year ago. I actually pulled it up, March 14th, 2024. Anyway, this bill, HR 7521, we have great naming of bills in our country in the US, basically said that only less than 20% of the ownership can be from and the specific things they said was like hostile foreign company or hostile foreign group together. So China is considered that, but we don't know of that other 30% or so that's owned by existing and new shareholders. What percent of those could be considered hostile? I think in our case in the US, that's from North Korea and Russia and China and a couple of other places. So the other issue is an operational perspective. So this is designed to allow the app itself to be run, controlled, including the algorithm specifically, not by TikTok in China, but by this US group. That's a little squishy too, because the group led by Oracle and Silver Lake and MGX will be able to evaluate the algorithm, but not necessarily change it at this point. Any changes coming up to the algorithm, by the way, algorithm changes happen all the time. There's always new things that are being put in there, but they're allowed to review and then decide whether to include or not. It's going to be an interesting process.
And who decides that usually?
What we think we know is that TikTok will retain a bunch of the business operations as well in the US. They'll be running the TikTok shop and they'll be running ad sales and they'll be running the brand. So it's interesting. What they're saying now is that the app's not going to change. You don't have to download a new app, even though supposedly they were developing a new app. That sales won't change. It's, in the US, you'll still be able to see all the global stuff. If you're in creating content in the US, it'll go out to everybody globally. So it's not like we're doing a content fork. But over time, I would think that the US is not going to approve every algorithm change. And if that's the case, the two apps are going to diverge. They're going to fork. What does that look like? That's a down the road thing. But for me, I'm worried about that too, because that could change the experience. That could change what's in there. And I don't know, I guess that's it. The other thing I think that's really interesting to keep in mind is the US Congress passed this bill HR 7521. And there are specific things in there that they required. And the ownership stuff, the control of the algorithm, et cetera, et cetera. And many members of Congress, both on the right and the left, are very concerned that this agreement violates a lot of those. The other thing that there's concern about is that TikTok will turn into basically X, and that the owners of it will change the algorithm such that it favors content that is friendly to the Republican right-wing side of our government. So anyway, that was a long, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here are the concerns. But yeah, that's as far as I can tell at this moment in time, that's where we are.
And with that said, identifying how important it is, then why do you think the valuation of this deal is so low? Can you explain that in terms of maybe is it the risk behind it? Reportedly, of course, we don't know all the facts yet, but is that part of it? Maybe because it's still considered high risk and maybe the direction that TikTok would be going and evolving as a platform for its US operations?
Yeah, that's a real head scratcher. So 14 billion was the value that's been put out there. Now it's also unclear to me, but is 14 billion the entire value of the US operation, or is it just the value of the 80% that's being divested from TikTok? Don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, information is still pouring in, exactly.
Right, exactly. And because TikTok retains 50% of the profit, you've got to then, that devalues what you're getting. So whether the 80% is being purchased for 14 or whether the 80% is being purchased for 11.2, which would be 80% of 14, you're not getting 100% of the value. You're only getting, if you're buying 80% and you're not getting all the value. So you've got to multiply. I just did some quick math and I used a 1.6 time multiplier because you're buying it for one thing, but you're not getting 50%. So it's going to be more. So in the end, you're paying either 22.5% if the whole thing is valued at 14 billion, or you're paying 28 billion, effective value of 28 billion if it's being purchased for it's being valued at 17.5. Either way, whatever you want to do here, that seems outrageously low because the people are speculating that the overall revenue for this TikTok US group is going to be around 22 billion this year. We know it was around 16 billion a couple of years ago. And it continues to grow. So for a high-tech thing like this, selling it roughly somewhere in there at 1x revenue seems, no matter how you calculate it, really low. And yes, there's risk. Yes, the asset has been devalued because of this going on for the last year plus. There are a lot of other elements that are happening in there. We're almost going on 2 years. Can you believe it? So, but it's still growing. People are still using it. It's still really valuable. People are getting their news there. So it's basically valued at somewhere around Snapchat. And Snap is a good thing, but it's not an amazingly big thing.
I wanted to ask you that since we're here in Abu Dhabi at the National, I wanted to ask you about the role of Abu Dhabi's MGX and what it stands to benefit from this deal. What do you see as the main benefit that it would receive from its shares that it would acquire if this were to go through and the facts that we know will play out?
Well, even at just 50% of the profit, I think that's a really good deal for MGX. So yes, I mean, we don't know what percentage of that 45 or 40% or whatever they're a
If
part
you
of.
divide it up, it might be what, like around 15%?
15, let's say it's 15%, right? So that's actually really good. And if it works, which it probably will, and TikTok's a great product, they're going to be generating a lot of cash and value. So from that perspective, I think it's great. It also gives you a little bit of cred or a lot of cred and maybe some chits to cash in with the US government and with the other investors that are coming in. So I think there's certainly value in that. The way that the US government is working these days, it's a really good idea to be on the good side of the people who are controlling the government. And then the other thing is, if you have a board seat, which I would assume I would want, right? So TikTok gets one, there's 6 others. I would assume each of the 3 big investment partners are going to get a board seat. You get a seat at the table. It's some fascinating stuff to learn about algorithm, learn about TikTok, learn about the way people are consuming content. So let's not devalue the insight that you're going to get into the way that the social, video, political, future world works, and you have a front row seat.
And from this, like, how do you see the UAE growing long term? I mean, do you have a sense of like what we'd likely see next as a result of this? I mean, I know, again, you were saying that this might not even happen or happen until sometime next year. But I'm just curious, like, do you see this as better access for the UAE to even like tech and other data and stuff like that from the US? Is this just like an entryway point into this world of social media tech?
Yeah, I think it's part of the long-term play that we see playing out in the UAE with the creator economy and with social. And as we met at this event, the Billion Followers Summit, that is being put on by an arm of UAE government that is really about wanting 10,000 creators to move to the US, to move to Dubai, and UAE wanting really to build the creator economy up. And it's a long-term play in the Emirates. And this I see as just another piece of it. And having, again, a seat at the table gives you access to a wide variety of information and insight, and however that sort of plays into the way the entire economy of the Emirates works and the information exchange way better than I do. I can't even speculate on that, but it does give you a seat at the table of one of the biggest players that are changing the world of media, information, and economy. I mean, this is it's going to be $500 billion globally, according to Goldman, in the next couple of years, the creator economy. And you are now a world player at what is happening right there. I think it's extremely interesting.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Jim. Appreciate it. To understand the tech side of things and how social media companies operate and influence content, I'm speaking to Fadat Jassim, who has worked for Twitter before it became X and is currently our head of data visualization at the National. Fadat, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Can you start us off by answering the big question that if Oracle, Silver Lake, and MGX take over US TikTok operations, what specific levers of control would these company owners have over the platform and the content that people see?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's very difficult to know for sure at this stage. So we don't know whether the deal is actually going to go through or not. A big part of this also depends on how quickly the data transfer happens. So the big part of this deal is that much of the user data, which is currently held in Beijing, is going to be slowly transferred over to the US. So the US version of TikTok will eventually have full ownership of that data. And once that takes time, so that won't be overnight. And once that data is transferred over, then the engineers who work on the algorithms themselves, for example, they might be able to work on changing the recommendation models. They might be able to work on changing the type of content people see on that particular platform. So A big part of this in terms of the ownership will really be dependent on the type of legislation and laws that the new US TikTok will want to implement as part of that version.
Like you mentioned the data transfer from China to the US. How significant is this, and particularly in whether collecting user data or also influencing what people see in terms of content?
Eventually, it will be both. I think, like I said to you, it takes time for the data transfer to happen. That will take some time. But I think the big question is more going to be around moderation and how they approach moderating the content itself and the type of content people see ultimately on their feeds. So it's based on recommendation. A lot of these algorithms are based on recommendation models, and you can have levers within those recommendation models. So how much of, sports content you might want to see as opposed to, let's say, political content, right?
This is based on user interest.
This is based on user interest, but it's also based on the way the algorithm is tweaked. So, for example, if the new US TikTok wanted to tone down on political content and actually increase more of the sports news that you see or content, then technically speaking, they can do that. But again, this shift won't happen overnight. And I think that's the real important thing here to highlight. Recommendation models take a lot of the current AI out there. They learn from user behavior. It takes time to corroborate that kind of level of content that they want. But yeah, a big part of this also goes back to the idea that many of these key figures included in this deal are somewhat seen as politically aligned to Trump. And Trump himself, his critics would say that he's not always been the arbiter of free speech, or his version of free speech may not coincide with the majority of other Americans. So I think a big part of this, the biggest change will probably be in the US itself. But again, that will probably take some time.
And so is it fair to say that whoever controls the data controls the algorithm?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it sounds like Oracle themselves will be kind of the biggest shareholder in this new deal. So ultimately, they will have majority control of that data, and this will remove access from the Chinese. So the Chinese oversight on American TikTok data will transfer directly to the US version of this. And it will also give the US government much greater access and leverage over that data. So I think ultimately what that data will mean in practice, not only will it give the US more oversight over the data and they will own it, but it also means potentially more moderation of some political speech that might align more with the current administration. It also might mean some changes in the amount of harmful content that appears online as well. But it's really hard to tell at this stage. This is all speculation. There also might be benefit for US creators because they'll be able to have maybe more control over how far their content gets on the algorithm. So how often their content is prioritized over world content, for example. So you could look at it both ways, really, in terms of a content creator ecosystem.
I would say that TikTok is one of the mainstream social media platforms out there that aren't American owned has actually been a go-to place for people who want to be more open about Arab issues. Of course, what comes to mind is the Palestinian issue and narratives that go out about it. And earlier in the conversation, we were talking about Netanyahu's comments saying this is the most important business deal taking place. And essentially he said this is the new battleground where they need to control the narrative to be able to win the war. So how do you see this deal changing that if ownership is transferring from Chinese ownership to majority US ownership? How do you see that affecting content?
Again, it's too early and too hard to tell, but we've seen that shift, right? If we take a step back and look at about what's happened over the last year and a half, a lot of these, even myself personally, when I was working in tech, the majority of content decisions were based around legal requirements for that particular region or country. So much of that, moderating part sat within the trust and safety teams, the content curation teams, and it didn't really go far beyond that, right? Traditionally speaking, a lot of these platform owners haven't really had much interest in the type of content or content moderation on a whole. It's always been important, but they've never really tried to be a part of that, right? To kind of make sure that they, again, are seeming impartial and that users feel like everyone's getting a voice heard. Whereas we've seen that shift. We saw that shift with the Musk Twitter takeover, which became X, and his opinions about what should be deemed harmful content and not changed quite a lot on the platform. It was the same after Zuckerberg's announcement, soon after Trump's election as well, in which he talked about scaling back on over-moderation as well. So we've definitely seen more of a gradual interest and increase from the wide political spectrum in kind of how these platforms are moderated. And I think what you mentioned in terms of Netanyahu's recent comments are very much top of mind for a lot of these politicians nowadays who understand the power and the influence of these platforms can have, especially in terms of social movements and in terms of activism, etc.
And I think that brings an important point of where do you see the direction of social media influence going? So now if TikTok is joining the rest and being majority American owned, do you see the freedom that people will have? The US is a country that has First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, but do you see maybe technocrats affecting, or owners of companies affecting how the content is going to look like moving forward? Just to get a sense of what does the future of social media interaction look like for Americans?
Well, I think that's already happening to some extent, right? I think, like I've said, we've seen this in the last year and a half. The shift is happening. I think Gaza definitely has been a catalyst for that as well. But also, I think we're moving into a world where a lot of the monopoly on these platforms is becoming more fragmented as well. So again, if we're talking about the future down the line, my personal prediction would be that people will choose to either opt out of being on these platforms or go to more alternatives. So we've already seen Blue Sky, we've seen things like Threads, which again is owned by Meta, but there's a lot more alternative platforms that people are choosing to focus on that aren't your traditional. I mean, if you think about just like about 3 or 4 years ago, the main platforms really were Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, right? And YouTube was part of that as well. But if you're talking about the quick, instant social media type of platforms, then they were the main ones. And now fast forward today, we're seeing more and more platforms emerge and people looking to choose alternatives and maybe a lot more people choosing to leave some of the big sites.
Yeah, it sounds like, it's already happened with mainstream American media, right? So like viewers will watch what aligns with their viewpoints and then they'll gravitate towards that. I mean, there's already Truth Social on social media. If you're more right-wing and Trump supporter, you'd go on that versus other platforms. So yeah, it sounds like just going to be more fragmented. And I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with TikTok then.
We'll wait and see, but we're heading towards more fragmentations, it seems.
For that, thanks so much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Business Extra from The National. Make sure to check out The National's podcast wherever you stream. This episode was produced by our podcast editor, Duat Farid. Arthur Edison is our audio engineer, and I've been your host, Salim Es Saeed.